How to Discuss the Truth by Mark Bellatini. The Reverend Mark Bellatini is minister of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Columbus, Ohio. He served as chair of the Hymn Book Resources Commission, which did this hymnal, and author of the 2008 UUA Meditation Manual Sonata for Voice and Silence Meditations, and the pamphlet Worship in UU Congregations, and another book that was printed by Skinner House on grief. How to discuss the truth. How to discuss the truth that some men love men and some women, and some both. And the children, with the children in the church school and church home. Nonchalantly, without drum rolls, without tiptoe preparations, without calculating and predicting to the nth degree, with candor, with open ears, with unfailing tenderness, with one foot in the realm of God and the other foot on that solid earth made of the ashes of Radcliffe Hall, Auden, Da Vinci, Emma Goldman, Susan B. Anthony, and Mark DeWolf, with real hope in our purpose and thanksgiving in our pulse, with the full iris of our living tradition in the eye, without using the inherited Augustinian scalpel that splits flesh from spirit and pleasure from good, without homilies on toleration, with the words some of us and not the words them and they, with as much heart as intellect, without embarrassment, with stories and examples as wonderful as a tale by Seuss, with rhapsodies of the glories of friendship, with gladness for uncertainties, with joy. Well, to start with, I wanted to tell you a little bit about some of the history surrounding the LGBTQ pride movement and bring you up to present by talking about why it's still very important to side with love when it comes to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people in our congregation. Some of the earliest lesbian and gay organizations: the Chicago Society for Human Rights, 1924. The Mattachine Society, 1950. Daughters of Bilitis, 1955. It sounds sort of like an ailment or something there. The last two sound pretty strange, especially, and they all might have been code word. You know, they didn't have those LGBTQ words back then in the titles. Well, it could be that they wanted to be talking in code, but Mattachine was referring to a French word for a Renaissance mask group, like a court jester, one who would speak the truth when no one else would while they were masked so they could get away with it. Daughters of Bilitis was a social group for lesbians, an alternative to bars, which besides being possibly an unhealthy place, seedy environment at that time, they could be raided since there were laws that prohibited same-sex dancing in the 1950s. And Bilitis was a fictional lesbian contemporary of Sappho. Just a quick aside, too, if you're not familiar with Sappho. She was a real woman who lived on the island of Lesbos, which is a Greek island, before Christ. She is known for her lyric poetry that was meant to be sung while accompanied by a lyre, those little handheld harps. She educated and acculturated young women on Lesbos, and much of her poetry that is known reflects the topics she wrote about women's daily lives, their relationships and rituals. She focused on the beauty of women and proclaimed her love for women. Before the mid-19th century, the word lesbian referred to any derivative or aspect of Lesbos. So you could have a lesbian wine, which some of you might like to try, or a lesbian villa, maybe. Beyond her poetry, she is well known as a symbol of love and desire between women now, with the English words sapphic and lesbian being derived from her name and the name of her home island. Well, I'm going to fast forward to the 1950s again. It was not easy to be LGBTQ in the 50s during the McCarthy era. The belief was that homosexuals were subversives, along with communists and others. Initially, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI did background checks on potential employees to prevent foreign agents from infiltrating the government. Then it was said that one's perverse sexual orientation could be used by spies to extort government secrets from them. So thousands of employees, some estimates 1,000, some estimates 3,000, of employees were fired, and perhaps even more left to avoid the background checks that Eisenhower approved, according to the Lavender Scare, which I think Cecily told me about, and then Mindy and I watched. It's a PBS documentary. It also talked on that documentary about Bruce Scott, a gay man who was fired from the federal government because of his sexual orientation. With an interest in government, Scott became a civil servant with the United States Department of Labor after serving in World War II. He moved to a new position in the department in Washington, D.C. He worked for the federal government until 1956, when he was forced to resign under the suspicion that he was a homosexual. When he reapplied to the federal government in the early 60s, his application was refused on the grounds that he was a known homosexual. By this time, Scott had helped found the Mattachine Society of Washington, an early gay rights organization. They had chapters all over, but that was one of them. So they quickly adopted an activist civil liberties agenda following the models of NAACP and ACLU, and the group supported a number of test discrimination cases in the courts. And Bruce Scott was one of the litigants in many of those cases. So in 1965, the Federal Court of Appeals ruled in Scott versus Macy that a vague charge of homosexuality was not grounds for disqualification from federal employment. When the government attempted to present more specific charges against Scott, the Court of Appeals again in 1968 found in his favor. And in 1975, having lost a number of similar cases, the Civil Services Commission was forced to suspend discriminatory exclusion of gays and lesbians. The policy change affected thousands of federal employees and contractors and set as the standard for employment practice. So Scott was under a great financial burden because of his inability to work for the federal government, and after intermittent periods of unemployment and underemployment, he left Washington, moved back to his hometown of Chicago, and began working with the state of Illinois, from which he retired after 20 years of service in 1985. How did this sea change start to happen then? Lesbian and gay organizations, as I mentioned, started organizing for rights on the heels of women's rights and African Americans voting and civil rights movements. After countless raids on gay bars, the Stonewall Bar in New York City was a breaking point, and gay people and drag queens took to the streets on June 28, 1969, through July 1st to protest the injustice. Eventually, the American Psychological Association took homosexuality off its mental illness list in 1973, but there was still legal job discrimination and discharges from the military. We chanted in gay pride parades, gay, straight, black, white, same struggle, same fight. Many of those struggles are the same, but one can say that I can pass as a straight person while someone of color cannot as easily pass as white, so sometimes there's contention there. I have some displays. The rainbow flag wasn't always the LGBT symbol. Before that, even, it was a symbol for cooperatives. But it became adapted to LGBT community because of diversity. One of my Halloween costumes, my friend Marcy calls Gay Sharon, is my rainbow clown wig and earrings, bright tie-dye pants, and usually I put on cross-country ski boots to look like a clown, and a man's dress shirt and tie to just look a little wacky, but that's my Gay Sharon outfit with the rainbow prominent. In 1989, responding to a question during a routine security clearance interview, Colonel Marguerite Kammermeyer disclosed that she is a lesbian. The National Guard, which she was a member of, began military discharge proceedings against her. In June 1992, she was honorably discharged. Kammermeyer filed a lawsuit against the decision in civil court, and in 1994, a judge of the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington ruled that her discharge and the ban on gays and lesbians serving in the military were unconstitutional. But discharges from the military just for being lesbian or gay didn't stop until 1995 when President Clinton softened that to that don't ask, don't tell policy. Colonel Kammermeyer actually returned to the National Guard and served as one of the few openly gay or lesbian people in the U.S. military while the don't ask, don't tell policy was in effect until her retirement in 1997. And there was even a movie about her service called Serving in Silence. She and her wife, Diane, became the first same-sex couple to get a marriage license in Island County, Washington State. So I have a t-shirt about her too, a quote from her. Who are we? We are your daughters, your sisters, your sons, your nurses, your mechanics, your athletes, your police, your politicians, your fathers, your doctors, your soldiers, your mothers. We live with you, care for you, help you, protect you, teach you, love you, and need you. All we ask is that you let us. Our current administration is still trying to undo some of the freedoms for LGBTQ people who want to serve in the military. I want to note that I believe that gay men were more visible than lesbians in the early days, having a few more freedoms and male privilege to be able to get away with being gay, along with at times being artistic, etc. But even Harvey Milk, a prominent gay politician in San Francisco, was gunned down, possibly for his outness and perhaps his politics, by one of his fellow city councilmen, I believe. Bisexual people were sometimes suspected, even in the gay community, as turncoats, so they may have had a bit harder time getting social acceptance as having a legitimate sexual orientation. And transgender people had an even harder time being accepted as a legitimate part of the movement because they had a different gender, not sexual orientation. In some cases, the anti-discrimination movement was more acceptable for them, though, under sex discrimination before others got rights. Now there's a frontier coming to be understood. It's called non-binary people. They've always been around, but those who cannot define themselves and or refuse to have others define them as one gender or another, instead believing that gender is a more fluid concept. They might use they and their as pronouns instead of he, him, his, or she, her, and use terms like queer or genderqueer that may at first be off-putting to people who've heard those as derogatory and put-downs before. But it's like the word dyke for me. Straight people shouldn't necessarily use it as an epithet, but they may be claimed as embracing diversity by the LGBTQ community. So when I came out in 1980, I was in a relatively safe place to do so in Ann Arbor, which had a human rights ordinance banning discrimination against LGBT people from early on, probably the early 70s. Even so, I was turned down for a job that I was well qualified for based on my appearance, my dress, the way I was dressed that day. And that was with a lesbian interviewing me along with her heterosexual male boss. Having a lesbian boss doesn't always make things perfect. I came out to my Presbyterian minister in Brooklyn, my hometown, and he told me he didn't think that was God's plan. I did struggle with what the Bible says in some parts, but a wonderful book called Is the Homosexual My Neighbor refuted many of the passages that people use to support discrimination. So look for that book if you still struggle with that or have friends and people who question you on that. So no wonder I became a Unitarian Universalist, which was one of the first very open denominations. It was the first, we were the first church in Jackson County in this area to be welcoming to LGBT people. But I will tell you that those early days kind of took a toll on my self-esteem. And when I moved back to the Jackson area, Mindy can tell you this too, I was fairly closeted, afraid of what people who knew me or my family would think. I didn't want Mindy to stop by my work because she looks like a lesbian. And I hustled us out of a movie theater right after the movie rather than someone I knew through work seeing us. It was a gay-themed movie. Don't wonder why he was there, but anyway. Not to mention, I have to tell you this too. I mean, some of this is true confessions. Mindy felt quite humiliated when I asked her not to attend or arrive separately to a Christmas party I was going to, where they were known lesbians hosting it, but their straight boss would be there who was a colleague in my field. And I was just kind of worried. So I guess to my, I don't know, to defend myself, sometimes at the time I was a executive director of an organization, sometimes the higher someone's status is, not that I was all that high then, but the harder they can fall if there are damaging rumors. So it is said, or rumored maybe, that even J. Edgar Hoover himself may have been gay. And he took great pains to keep information that may have corroborated that out of the limelight. I started feeling more comfortable being out when I attended a conference on spirituality and LGBT issues. There I heard about a wonderful organization called Whosoever, based on the biblical passage, "Whosoever believeth in me shall have everlasting life." So it means LGBT people aren't automatically going to hell, as so many Christian churches believe. I attended the conference, got the t-shirt, and I will tell you a story about Candace Chellew Hodge, who founded Whosoever. She was a recovering Southern Baptist. Born in 1965 as the youngest of 5 children to a Southern Baptist minister and his wife. She says she grew up in the church playing with her G.I. Joe dolls and Tonka trucks in the sanctuary aisles. But her family was still shocked when she came out as a lesbian years later, despite obvious clues. She gave up her Southern Baptist faith at age 17, and then about during her college years later, found the Metropolitan Community Church, which you might call a gay church. It's very much gay people and their allies. She entered seminary and was preaching in churches like that, and started the magazine Whosoever. And actually, she feels at this point that she's kind of outgrown even just the Christian faith. So she says, perhaps in a world where just about every Christian denomination still forbade practicing LGBT people from serving in pulpits and other leadership positions, and marriage equality was laughable, if not impossible, Whosoever was an audacious act of courage on my part. Honestly, it just felt like a ministry, a calling, something I couldn't not do. And she especially wanted to outreach to people who felt even suicidal because of not being able to reconcile, or their families not being able to reconcile Christianity with their sexual orientation. Along the way, I've gotten to know many people, she says, who both support and oppose the movement for complete acceptance of LGBT people in both the church and society at large. Most rewarding, however, have been the many letters I've received over the years from people who found hope, love, and reconciliation within the pages of this magazine. I know that Whosoever has literally saved the lives of people who believed the lie that God hated them and would send them to hell if they lived into their authentic identity as a lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender person. She also says, though, I am grateful for everyone who wrote hate mail to me over the years, because those are the people who challenged me the most to continue to grow my faith and continue to act with courage in the face of hatred. In the end, they are the ones who made me a more gentle, loving, and generous person, because they pointed out the places where I was still being violent, hateful, and selfish. Her faith has evolved after shuttering that website 4 years ago and then finding somebody else to take it over. She now pastors Jubilee Circle, an intentional, progressive, inclusive community of faith in Columbia, South Carolina. She says, I find that my personal theology has shifted so drastically over the years that I no longer can proclaim to be a Christian in any orthodox or traditional sense of the word. She's always been a member of the more progressive spectrum of faith, but this year, over the past year, when she was making the decision to close Whosoever's website down, she found a line of theological thinking that was so completely captured her heart and transformed her life in a way that even progressive Christianity had not been able to do so. She's an ardent follower of Jesus, but believes Jesus' true message, a message of transformation, not just for ourselves, but for this world, has been covered over by millennia of useless theology and dogma. So she kind of talks about wanting to serve the most needy and not just spout dogma, I guess, which I'm not saying all Christian churches do, but she was tired of that. People are still starving today while we argue the finer points over whether God loves LGBT people. And she can't live with that kind of religion anymore. So here's an unattributed quote from the Whosoever Facebook page. When I see people fired or kicked out of their church denomination for standing with the LGBTQ community or for preaching the gospel of the oppressed, I often write them and welcome them to the company of the marginalized, to the company of Jesus. Eventually, Mindy and I were out enough and felt comfortable enough, even in Jackson, to be interviewed for an article about gay people in the Jackson Citizen Patriot. I think we didn't use our full names there, though. We were still a little scared of the public, I suppose. And I believe that was around the time that a nasty anti-gay ballot initiative did pass in Michigan, despite LGBTQ people's efforts. And thankfully, we've moved beyond that some. Now I want to shift gears a little bit about the welcoming congregation movement, which started about 25 years ago, and we became a welcoming congregation sometime after that. There's still about 300 UU churches who haven't formally taken that stand. So they want to, it could be this, that they didn't have time or something, you know, but they want them to do that. So I'll talk about kind of like welcoming renewal, welcoming part 2, which for those 300 churches, they want them to join the fold. But another thing I was going to bring a t-shirt about was standing on the side of love, and it's a gold t-shirt, and some of you remember our gold banner that we put outside the church. That movement was started in the 2008 after a shooting, speaking of shooting, at Tennessee Valley Unitarian Universalist Church. A man came to the church angry about its liberal views, including LGBT issues. So the Knoxville community, where it was, responded with an outpouring of love that inspired the leadership at the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association, to launch a campaign that would harness love's power to challenge exclusion, oppression, and violence based on sexual orientation, gender identity, but also adding immigration status, race, religion, or any other identity. Our church has that banner, and I have that t-shirt. Unfortunately, they're out of date. This movement has been renamed Siding with Love to take the ableist reference some people saw standing as having. Yes, you can stand for something, but if you take somebody's perspective who cannot stand, would rolling on the side of love or signing on the side of love, would that encompass you if you didn't roll or you didn't sign? No, so standing on the side of love, they decided to just rename Siding with Love, because then everybody could side with love. So, as I mentioned, the Welcoming Congregation program has morphed some too, and here are the 5 practices of welcoming renewal that I asked Reverend Jen, and she agreed that we could kind of start with that with this sermon. First, if we're not already, but we are, become a welcoming congregation, and then have welcoming worship services, at least 2 per year, it says. That can include a pride service or something like this today. There are welcoming days of observance, and so there's a lot of opportunities for having themes along this line throughout the year, and I forgot to print that, but I will print that and make it available to Reverend Jen and the worship committee so we can decide on other times to do welcoming kinds of services. And there are welcoming congregation modules, which in the UU tradition means trainings. If we want to do some trainings, there's always things available, like watching a movie and discussing it and things like that. And then it says support a welcoming project. So it encourages the congregation to be involved with, say, fundraising efforts, donating to PFLAG. I don't know if that's one of the groups that we support now or not, but things like that. So I'm just near the conclusion here. I chose the title Radical Hospitality as a reminder that we should always be welcoming to visitors in our church. And some of you may remember, who've been here a while, that we talked about this with, I think it was Reverend Jill having a sermon when Hugh came to the audience, came to the congregation that day dressed in a gorilla costume. Not anybody didn't know what he was, because he was, or who he was, because he was so costumed. So, and then some of you also may remember some years ago, a person who visited our coffee hour a few times looking like she was going to an aliens convention. She had her face so covered up, she looked kind of like an astronaut. And people were a little concerned, who is this person among us? I had heard she had environmental allergies, which kind of answered the question for me, and I was welcoming of her here. But I have to say I didn't do as good a job when someone wearing lipstick and feminine attire attended a lesbian dinner we were throwing. I challenged her, kind of asking her in an email later, what are you? Well, that wasn't very welcoming of me. Yes, that's Sharon. Very uncool of Sharon in this current modern age of gender fluidity. In fact, yes, I learned a new acronym in this month's UUA magazine, and when I looked it up at the Welcoming Congregation program, it was mentioned too. It's TGQNB, which stands for Transgender, Queer, Non-Binary, and it can encompass anyone who feels they do not fit into the stereotypical male-female heterosexual roles. There is room for people who are different from us, including those on the autism spectrum, for instance, and gender non-binary. What if instead we embrace difference? Lesbian and gay people fought for the right to adopt children and are still denied by some Christian adoption agencies that have conservative religious beliefs. And when a lesbian couple in Detroit recently were not allowed to adopt their foster children together, they went all out with attorney, who is now Attorney General, Dana Nessel, and took the right to marry to the Supreme Court and won. Now Mindy and I even tell casual acquaintances we are married, and it usually goes over well. Or we call it, I refer to her as my spouse. I guess wife for me sometimes is a little bit loaded, but I use that sometimes too, and especially in endearments. But yesterday at Art Van, we were kind of looking at a chair, and I was helping Mindy in and out of her chair to try on chairs, and the salesman said, "What are you, sisters?" Sometimes they just have to figure it out. And in fact, there's a lesbian button or gay button that says, "We are not just good friends." And I have for coffee hour my gay pride puzzle, which is a jigsaw puzzle of a lot of those buttons. And if you have any questions about what they mean, if you want to look at it, feel free to ask. I have had several of them in my life. But I said, no, we're spouses. And usually these days people say, oh, okay, good, or something like that. Or he might have been saying, oh, first gay couple who I know that I've served. So that's good. What the heck? I've seen that our state laws and rulings can sway in the breeze and even lose ground depending on what attorney general or what president, et cetera, is in power at the time, what governor. And I alluded to the regressive approach that our current administration is taking with LGBTQ rights. So it's important for heterosexual people as well to stick up for gay rights too. So I'm asking you to side with love. And don't let politicians and conservative religious groups be a voice that drowns out the voice of truth, justice, and reason. Thank you.